Ever wonder, like, what kind of stuff people were saying behind closed doors when the U.S. was trying to figure out how to deal with Cuba and their whole revolution thing?
Oh, yeah, it's always the whispers and the backroom deals that are the most
Yeah.
intriguing, right? Especially when a whole country's future's at stake.
Well, today we're getting a peek behind that curtain thanks to these two declassified documents from October 1959.
Oh, 1959. Right in the thick of it.
Yeah, these are like little snapshots of private conversations, folks tied to anti-Castro groups, trying to figure out their next move.
I bet there was a lot of tension and uncertainty in those discussions.
For sure. And that's what we're going to dive into today. We're going to try to understand who these people were, what they wanted, and what they thought was going to happen. It's like a historical puzzle piecing together these whispers from the past.
And what's so cool about these documents, they're not like official statements or anything. They feel so raw, like we're right there in the room with them.
Right. So the first one is a memo summarizing a tape-recorded conversation. It went down in Miami on October 19th and 20th, 1959.
Okay, Miami makes sense. A lot of Cuban exiles ended up there.
Exactly. And the players are William D. Pawley, a former U.S. ambassador. So, he's got some serious connections.
Not just some random dude off the street.
Nope. And he's talking to this unidentified Cuban.
Ooh, a mystery man. Gotta love that.
Right. And the memo also mentions a second conversation, same time frame, Pawley with two other Cubans.
So, multiple perspectives. Interesting.
Yeah, and the memo itself was written up on October 20th, 1959, so they were taking notes in real time.
Hot off the presses. They knew this stuff was important.
You got it. And then the second document you sent is another memo. It seems to pick up right where the first one left off. It talks about Pawley asking this Cuban group whether they felt like they had the U.S.'s moral support. Like, are we with you on this?
That's a big question. Even without direct help, having someone powerful in your corner just saying, "We're with you," can be a game changer.
Totally. It's like that feeling of we're not alone in this fight. So as we go through these conversations, keep your ears peeled for what these guys were really hoping to achieve. How'd they see the situation in Cuba? What did they want from the U.S.? And what are those aha moments that make us understand this time period better? Okay, so that first chat, Pawley and the mystery Cuban. The memo says this Cuban was introduced to Pawley through a wealthy anti-Castro Cuban's son-in-law, and the son-in-law had just met with Pawley's crew.
Sounds like they were building a network, huh?
Yeah, you don't just stumble into a meeting with a former U.S. ambassador. There were definitely some connections being made behind the scenes. Makes you wonder who else was involved.
And this Cuban, he was convinced that members of a specific anti-Castro group were ready to make their move.
So they weren't just talking, they were ready to act.
Yep. The memo mentions SFNE 32 and an interest in the central Escambray region. Sounds like the Segunda Frente del Escambray, the second front of the Escambray. Oh yeah, those guys. They were fighters who went up against Batista, and now they were potentially turning against Castro. Makes sense they'd be in the Escambray Mountains. That was their stronghold.
Right, like their home turf. And the memo says they were getting impatient with this group called the American Friends of the Second Front. Like, come on, guys, let's do this.
I can almost hear the frustration in their voices. They're on the ground, ready to fight, and maybe they're feeling like those back in the U.S. aren't moving fast enough.
Totally. It's like less talk, more action. The memo even says Eugenio Bueno, a journalist from Diario de la Marina in Havana, had also been talking about this.
Diario de la Marina. That was a big newspaper back then. So this wasn't just a fringe idea. It was being discussed in the media, at least a little bit.
Right. And this unidentified Cuban, he mentioned that his group had some cash and were doing their own thing, but he couldn't understand why the U.S. wasn't more interested in helping out with the whole revolution situation.
Interesting. It's like they wanted the U.S. to acknowledge what was going on and maybe even support their efforts, but they weren't necessarily looking for a full-blown U.S. intervention.
Yeah, they wanted to be their own force, with a little boost from Uncle Sam. And he said he represented a group led by Dr. Huber Matos. Big name. He was a leader in the revolution who later broke with Castro.
Oh yeah, Matos. He was a respected figure, so his involvement would definitely lend credibility to this group.
Right. And they had other important folks with them, organized under the name Purieza. Their main areas were Oriente, Las Villas specifically, the Escambray, and Santa Clara and Matanzas.
So they were spread out, not just focused on Havana. That could make things tricky for Castro.
The memo even says they thought two of their provinces were better organized than Havana and Pinar del Rio.
Wow, that's a bold statement. They were confident in their network. Okay, so that's one perspective. Now let's see what the other two Cubans had to say.
All right, conversation number 2. These guys were straight up. They needed 2 things: moral support and money.
Classic combo. Every revolution needs a little bit of both.
But here's the catch. They said they had no way to raise the funds themselves and thought doing anything right then, even with the economy tanking under Castro, was too risky.
So they were more cautious, less gung-ho than the first guy. They recognized the challenges.
Took time. They even said pumping money into their efforts would be like putting money down a rat hole.
Ouch. And not exactly a vote of confidence.
Right. And they had their reasons. First, the anti-Castro groups weren't united at all. We're seeing that already just from these conversations.
Yeah, a divided opposition is a weak opposition.
Second, they thought most Cubans either didn't care about the opposition or were pro-Castro.
That's a tough reality to face. If the people aren't behind you, it's an uphill battle.
And third, they claimed a lot of Cubans were actually against anyone trying to overthrow Castro. So not just indifferent, but actively opposed.
Wow, that's a whole different level of resistance.
It's a tough picture, right? Makes you wonder what everyday Cubans were thinking and feeling at that time.
It's easy to forget that history isn't just about the big players. It's about the lives of everyday people caught in the middle.
So true. Now, Pawley, he listened to all this, and he agreed that the Cuban economy was going downhill fast. He thought that if things got bad enough, people might turn on Castro. But until then, he thought any attempt at a revolution was too dangerous.
So he's saying, let's wait and see. Let the situation ripen a bit.
But that's a gamble, right? You never know how long a regime can hold on, even when things are rough.
True, and while you're waiting, the opposition might lose momentum or get crushed. It's a delicate balance.
And that brings us to the million-dollar question. Did these Cuban groups feel like they had the U.S.'s moral support? Pawley asked them straight up, and their answer: they wanted the U.S. to be on their side, whether or not they got any actual help. They felt like they had to keep going no matter what.
That's powerful stuff. They needed that validation, that sense of legitimacy, even if it didn't come with guns and money.
It's like they were saying, believe in us, we're doing this for the right reasons.
And sometimes that belief can be just as important as material aid. It can fuel a movement, give them the strength to keep fighting.
But Pawley, he didn't have an easy answer for them. He said he needed to think about what could be done. Then he dropped a little bombshell. He mentioned talking to the U.S. Dominican consul about the revolution happening over there.
Wait, the Dominican Republic, what's the connection there?
He was worried about a potential flood of Cuban exiles into the Dominican Republic if things went south in Cuba, and he wanted the Dominican government to get involved.
Interesting. Maybe he saw the Dominican Republic as a safer place to support the Cuban opposition, less risky than direct U.S. involvement.
Yeah, maybe. Or maybe he was just worried about a refugee crisis on America's doorstep. Either way, it adds a whole other layer to this story.
It shows how interconnected everything was. The Cuban Revolution wasn't just a Cuban issue. It had implications for the whole region.
So what do you make of all these different voices and perspectives? What stands out to you?
Honestly, I'm struck by how divided the anti-Castro movement was, even at this early stage. They couldn't agree on whether to act now or wait, whether they needed money or just moral support, whether they wanted U.S. help or wanted to go it alone.
Yeah, it's like they were all speaking different languages, even though they had the same goal.
And that lack of unity, that must have been a huge problem. Hard to build a strong opposition when everyone's pulling in different directions.
Totally. And what about Pawley? What's his role in all this?
To me, he seems like a guy trying to make sense of a chaotic situation. He's gathering information, weighing the options, but he's not committing to anything yet.
Cautious but engaged. He knows this is important, but he doesn't want to rush into anything.
Makes sense. A wrong move by the U.S. could have had huge consequences, not just for Cuba, but for the whole Cold War.
And all these conversations, these whispers in back rooms, they show that the U.S. was definitely paying attention to what was happening in Cuba. They knew there was opposition to Castro, even if it was messy and disorganized.
Yeah, and they were trying to figure out how to respond, how to play their cards right in this high-stakes game.
So we've been through a lot today. We've heard from different players, seen their hopes and fears, and got a glimpse of the U.S.'s early involvement in this whole Cuban Revolution drama.
It's like we've time-traveled back to 1959, eavesdropped on some secret conversations, and gotten a feel for the uncertainty and tension of the moment.
And it reminds us that history isn't just dates and names in a textbook. It's about real people making tough choices, trying to navigate a world that's constantly changing.
And those choices, they have ripples that affect us even today.
Okay, so one last thing to ponder. What if the U.S. had gone all in with the Segunda Frente del Escambre back then? What if they'd given them the support they were asking for? How do you think that would change things?
That's the big what if, right? Would it have led to a different Cuba, a different Cold War? It's impossible to know for sure, but it's a question worth asking. It makes you think about the power of choices, the paths not taken, and how even the smallest decisions can have huge consequences.
Food for thought. And that's it for our deep dive today. Thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure. Until next time, keep exploring those hidden corners of history. You never know what you might find.